Great. So I'm going to share some slides and I put a link in the chat for some interactive polling and voting. Like Julie mentioned, would love for this to be interactive and engaging. I won't be able to see the chat, but you can just unmute yourself and talk, or Julie, if you can let me know, or somebody can let me know if there are comments in the chat. I'm happy to just answer questions that way. So I'm excited to be here, a little sad about Hopin. I've used Hopin previously, and I had a different experience that I think Julie's probably over it forever now, but don't give up on Hopin just yet, you guys. I'm excited to be here this morning to talk about inclusive entrepreneurship and to really just have a conversation. I'll share with you some stories. I'll share with you some data that you may not know. And I've got a couple of questions that I would love for you to answer as we walk through all of this. So hopefully you can see my screen. Can you guys see the mentimeter.com inclusive entrepreneurship? Great, awesome. So I just want to start with a story about my grandmother. So data shows that one of the best ways you can determine if a person will actually engage in entrepreneurship is if they have parents who've been entrepreneurs or grandparents who've been entrepreneurs or inventors or innovators. There's been a lot of research about that. And one of the earliest innovators I saw was my grandmother. She was born in 1921, the oldest of 19 brothers and sisters. And she did drop out of school in second grade to help take care of them. And so at 8 years old, she was taking care of these younger brothers and sisters. At the time, there weren't that many, but she ultimately ended up with 18 siblings. And when I was growing up, we'd go see her and spend time with her. And she always had a hustle. She always had multiple things she was selling. She was always innovating. I distinctly remember when my little sister was teething, she invented this product that was a combination of mechanical and agricultural innovation. And it would immediately stop like her teething pain, my little sister at the time. And she would talk to me often about how she grew up and how it wasn't always pretty, obviously, in the 1920s and 1930s in Saluda, South Carolina. But one of the things she always told me was that the ideas in my head could change the world. And I believed it. I believed that good ideas could change the world. And I see this everywhere now, including, so Julie mentioned during her remarks, that innovation plan from 2017. And one of the things that came out of that innovation plan that I consistently see out of the Office of Innovation is this definition of innovation as the relentless pursuit of transformational ideas. And the thing that I want to leave you with today, if nothing else, is that we cannot really pursue the transformational ideas and the relentless pursuit of those transformational ideas if it doesn't include the entire diaspora of South Carolina. And the ways in which we do that require a little bit of unpacking, and that's okay. What I'd like to do today is do a little bit of that unpacking so that we can brainstorm around how we can create an inclusive entrepreneurship ecosystem that allows our daughters, our neighbors, our fellow South Carolina residents to help transform South Carolina in this way. So what I'd like to talk about as we go through this conversation is what it means to be innovative in this space. And so this is the definition from the Council for Innovation Initiatives. And this quote that I heard a staff member at the University of Texas has stuck with me for a long time. And the thing he has said many times is that innovation cannot be stopped. It can only be rejected or redirected. And the way for us to be part of innovation is to embrace it and to be part of this evolution. And if we resist inclusivity as innovation is happening, what will happen is startups will become more irrelevant. We'll talk about what some of the data shows about how being inclusive actually improves not just the ecosystem of the state and workplaces, but also the financial health of startups and larger businesses. So we have to really think about how we are going to be relevant as it relates to inclusivity in a rapidly changing world. So what I'd like to do today is talk about the landscape in South Carolina and nationwide a bit and how we fit there, the problem, and then the opportunities we have and some solutions that I know many of you are already working on. I've talked to a lot of you on this Zoom conversation about this, and had some pretty heated discussions with some of you here about what it looks like to be inclusive in this space. So that's just the framing that I'd like to give. Like Julie mentioned, I'm from Clemson, so you're going to see a lot of that obnoxious orange, and that is okay. We will just roll with it. And I appreciate the invitation from Julie and Laura to talk about this today. So let's start with the landscape. If you pulled up that link that I put in the chat, hopefully it's still there. What I would like to start with is a question. And so this is some research that has happened with the US Census, with the Minority Business Development Association, with lots of different groups around where South Carolina and everybody else in the country sits as it relates to innovation and entrepreneurship. So the first interactive question, if you could use the link to vote, is what percentage of South Carolina's population is starting new businesses? So if you think about the entire state, how many people in our state are actually starting new businesses? So you can either go to menti.com and use the code at the top, or you can use that link that I put in the chat. Hopefully it is still accessible to vote. But take a look at those numbers. What percentage of South Carolina's population is starting new businesses? And you should be able to vote, and it should start to show your answers as you vote. If that doesn't happen, we will be par for the course today with technology. But as we are thinking through these things, I'm just going to open the chat and include the link here. And unfortunately, I am not seeing your votes, but should be able to see your votes, but I do not see your votes, so we're just going to move on. The correct answer is 0.25% of South Carolina's population is starting new businesses. We are around the national average. We're maybe a little bit lower than the national average, which is 0.27%, but we have about the amount of entrepreneurial activity happening in South Carolina as it relates to population as just about everybody else in the country. We're right in the middle. And that is not bad, not great, but not bad. And so the second question I'd like to ask you is, what percentage of South Carolina's businesses are owned by people of color, people who are not white? Oh, and there we go. We've got some votes here. And let's see, I'll give just a couple seconds for people to vote. I'm glad it's working this time. I don't know why the first question didn't work. So let's see, a lot of you are in the 10%, 5% range, which is pretty interesting. Pretty interesting. Okay, so let's see. The correct answer is actually 20%. So the percentage of South Carolina's businesses owned by people of color, large and small, so the full range of businesses in South Carolina is about 20%. And that's actually a pretty good number. It's better than what is happening in some places around the country. So if we think about where we sit, we're actually not doing too bad in terms of businesses being owned by people of color, if we think about it just in terms of numbers. But what also is true is that as the number of businesses is growing, what also is not happening is growth. And so Julie and Laura outlined pretty clearly through the Relentless Challenge that oftentimes when we're talking about funding companies and supporting companies that are entrepreneurial, that are startups, we think about that in terms of high scaling businesses, but that is not something that's actually happening. South Carolina is at the top of a lot of lists as it relates to the number of businesses owned by women. We are actually pretty close to achieving parity. We're usually in the top 3 to 5 of all states in the United States as it relates to the number of businesses. But when we think about that in terms of growth, we're near the bottom of every list as it relates to financial health of these companies that are being started by people who are not white men. And in our country, this is a bit of a problem when we think about what's happening with our demographics, right? So right now, entrepreneurs are 80% white and 64.5% or so male. These numbers are not reflective of our country's increasingly diverse population. And this diversity gap is costing us not just in terms of inclusive excellence, but also in terms of financial wealth and financial health. And according to some reports, if people of color and women achieved parity as it relates to startup and entrepreneurial activity, the US would add as many as 10 million jobs to the economy. We'd make hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars or we'd bring in hundreds of millions or billions of dollars in financial resources if we achieved some level of parity that at least looks like the demographics of our country. And so it's a problem as it relates to the United States, but in South Carolina in particular, there's some pretty nuanced numbers that as you're thinking about your Relentless Challenge applications, some places where there are real opportunities. So the next slide here is about the percentage of US venture capital dollars and where they actually go. So as it relates to women in particular, what percentage do you think of venture capital dollars go to all women-owned teams? So this is a national question, not just in South Carolina, but I'll relate it to South Carolina in a moment. And so we've got some good votes, a couple of people at 50% or 30%, most at 2%. Those of you who are saying 2%, I'm going to try to rush a little because I know we're behind, but the correct answer, most of you got the correct answer, is actually it's not 5%, it's 2%. So the technology is going to work against me here a little bit too. The correct answer is 2%, not 5%. And so when we think about this, we have in South Carolina 41% of women-owned businesses, not all startups, but this is the best data I could find from the US Census and other places. We have lots of women-owned businesses. We don't have those businesses really achieving financial parity. And on top of that, we don't have a lot of venture capital dollars going to all women teams. And I'll explain why this is particularly troublesome in South Carolina in a moment. But before I do that, if we drill down just a little, what percentage of venture capital dollars go to Black women-led teams? And I'll give you a couple of minutes to think about the answer to that question. But when we start to drill down, there are a lot of reasons for these gaps. And so some of you are voting now. I'll give you a couple seconds to vote around this specific question about venture capital dollars going to Black women-led teams. And let's see, I'll give you like another few seconds or so to do this. And let's see, so a lot of you said 19. The correct answer is basically 0. The accurate answer, sorry, there was supposed to be another slide there, but the accurate answer is 0.0006%. Like literally in the past, I guess, let's see, the most recent data is from 2018. Percentage of venture capital dollars going to Black women-led teams is statistically insignificant. It is basically 0%, 0.0006%. And when we talk about other types of startups, 1% of venture founders or 1% of founders who are venture-backed are Black, about 2% are Latino, Middle Easterners, about 3%, a little bit less than 3%. And so why is this a problem? It's a problem for a number of reasons, but particularly we are missing key opportunities to solve our state's biggest problems, especially in an ecosystem that is largely driven by venture capital. Venture capital, and I know all of you know this already, is oftentimes the gasoline of the fire that is entrepreneurship. It accelerates the path to high growth potential companies. But the role of venture funding actually goes beyond money, right? It includes guidance for young entrepreneurs. It includes access to networks. It includes other successful business leaders helping and supporting and being a magnet, frankly, for follow-on funding. And this is hard for everybody, right? This is really hard for a lot of people. And I'm gonna skip through this slide and come back to it in a moment. But I want to make sure we drill down on this point. I know a lot of you know this already, but 78% of all venture capital funding goes to just 3 states, California, New York, and Massachusetts. And so it's hard, generally speaking, it's really hard in the South because the rest of the country is dividing up less than 30% of the accessible venture capital funding. And when you layer gender, race, ethnicity on top of this, it is very, very difficult to get the resources you need to start a business. And of course, it's also true that this is hard for all entrepreneurs, right? I think the numbers hover around 98 or 99% of ideas are rejected by venture capitalists for any number of different reasons. But when we think about the difficulties specifically for women and for people of color, there are multiple layers to this specific issue. And there could be any number of reasons why the gaps are so large. I think we intuitively know what some of those are. There's economic inequality, there's access to networks, and then there's exposure. And I want to talk more. I set my timer, so I'm just taking a look at how much time I have. I'll come back to why these gaps are so large, but these are typically the 3 things that stunt growth of startups and entrepreneurship when it comes to women and people of color. And I want to give you a specific example of this. This is Harold Hughes. I know a lot of you know Harold. Harold has done really well in his startup. He's raised a little more than $2 million. He might be closer to 3 million right now. He's from South Carolina, Jamaican American, first generation American. And this is a picture of us. I have a podcast. I interviewed Harold for the podcast, and he's been very transparent about his opportunities for growth and about his experience in South Carolina. He's been very complimentary to the entrepreneurship ecosystem. He's had a lot of great mentors in the entrepreneurship ecosystem in South Carolina, but there also were difficulties for him as a South Carolinian who grew up in Columbia, as a Clemson graduate, raising money for his startup. And he tells the story in the podcast as he is building his business, working full time and hustling, and then quitting his job to focus on his company, which is a blockchain-based ticketing platform. He talks about his experience raising money for his startup. And he tells the story in the podcast about how he was keeping track of the number of investors he was talking to when he was starting. And as he was doing this, he started to get a little bit dejected because he took 144 meetings with investors who all said no. So as he was traveling around the state of South Carolina, mostly in the Southeast, talking to people about funding his startup, he got 144 no's. And I thought that sounded pretty bad when he told me. I had no frame of reference for data to back that up. I know we've got some VCs here who have that data. One of the things that happened this year in March was DocuSend released a report on the state of pre-seed funding for startups. And it is a really, really interesting report. If anybody's interested in it, I'm happy to share a link with you if you want to take a look at it. And one of the really interesting data points they mentioned in this report is the number of meetings and the amount raised by startups, and they break it out by the number of founding team members, right? And so like this slide that I'm showing you here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is the number of founding team members. So Harold started his company by himself. He's a single founder of his company, which is called Bandwagon Fan Club Incorporated. And note that the average amount raised pre-seed is $273,000 for a startup with a single founder. And the number of meetings taken is right around 34, 33.9. And so compare that to Harold's experience as a startup founder in South Carolina, taking 144 meetings and getting 144 no's with what we see comparatively happening around the United States. And this report comes from DocuSend, not DocuSign. DocuSend released this report in March of this year. And it's fascinating for so many reasons, particularly because entrepreneurship is all about finding and exploiting new opportunities, right? And what the data shows us, particularly in the South and in South Carolina, is that there's a clear opportunity here. because there is a gap in the market and nobody really has stepped in to fill that gap. And I say nobody, I don't really mean nobody, but we've not really achieved parity as it relates to closing this gap, as it relates to inclusive entrepreneurship. And we should, and there are a number of reasons why we should. And I see that there are comments in the chat. I cannot see what they are, but if you want to talk about anything, please just unmute yourself and we definitely can talk about these things. But here's why it makes sense for opportunities around inclusive entrepreneurship. This is why it makes sense. This is why we need to be thinking about this right now. And it is not just philanthropic. So obviously closing the opportunity gap is the right thing to do just because it's the right thing to do, but it is not just a philanthropic thing. When we talk about scale, right, and creating scalable solutions to problems, there are a ton of people who crunch the numbers, who've looked at what the results are when you have diversity in your teams. In fact, so when I asked you earlier about women-led teams and pointed out that 2% of venture capital funding goes to women, what the data shows is that female founder teams that are female founded perform 63% better than all male teams. What the research shows is that women-led teams have a 35% higher return on investment than startups run by men. This is a huge chasm in the marketplace right now. There's a group of people who are starting companies in South Carolina at the same rate as men, who are getting 2% on the average nationwide of venture capital funding, but achieving a 35% higher return on investment when they are venture backed. And that is, as I mentioned before, a wide gap that I think we can close. When we think about racially diverse organizations and teams, they are likely to outperform their peers in profitability by a rate of about the same, about 35%. And when you look at the financial health of companies, particularly startups, according to McKinsey, according to the Kauffman Foundation, companies that have gender diversity, racial and ethnic diversity, they're more likely to have higher financial returns. And when they have lower levels of gender and racial diversity, they're not just doing average, they're actually doing worse. They're not achieving above average returns. So diversity isn't just something to do to look like whatever your state looks like or whatever your community looks like. It actually is good business. And according to McKinsey, diversity is a competitive differentiator when we talk about market share. Market share typically goes to companies that have more diverse teams. And when we think about what that means in terms of numbers, for example, there was a study a couple of years ago around American innovation and the lack of diversity with patent owners and with inventors. And if we could achieve at least just demographic parity as it relates to inventors and innovation, we could increase our country's GDP by as much as like 3 or 4%. And so this is good business. This makes good financial sense. And then as it relates to attracting diverse talent, so this is one of the metrics for the Relentless Challenge grants. Migration trends are favorable for attracting diverse talent when you create a great entrepreneurial ecosystem. There's actually right now a reversal of migration to the South, particularly for Black Americans. More Black people are moving back to the South from the Midwest or from the Northeast than any other group. And the places where they are moving are seeing increased startup activity, increased activity as it relates to job growth, increased return on investment when they are invested in through venture capital funds or whatever the case may be. And so if we're talking about attracting diverse talent, one of the really strong ways to do this is by creating an inclusive entrepreneurship ecosystem that says, hey, if you are a college graduate, and these are just what the numbers show, college graduates starting businesses are attracted to places that have strong, inclusive entrepreneurship ecosystems. And many of these are right in the South. And so this is not like, people of color are avoiding the South because of any number of different reasons. So when you look at the top 10 states of, as it relates to like places that are good for entrepreneurs who are people of color, who are diverse, 7 of the top 10 best states for people of color who are entrepreneurs are in the South. And they're all our neighbors. They're Georgia, they're North Carolina, Virginia, Florida. And so we could be part of that too. And I think we have a lot of the right foundations to be one of those states. It's really, really good for diverse entrepreneurs, even with some of the difficulties and the challenges. So what I'd like to do in the last, I think I have about 6 or 7 minutes or so, is talk about some of the solutions, right? So knowing that there are these gaps in the marketplace and knowing that there are really good foundations, what are some of the things you can do, particularly if you're thinking about like your Relentless Challenge applications and the metrics around talent development, around access to capital, around innovation and entrepreneurship? What can these things look like? So I will just share a couple of my ideas about this. And I'm going to try to, let's see. I wanted to try to open my screen, but I can't. So there's this quote that I know we've all seen or heard many times from Wayne Gretzky about I skate to where the puck is going, not where it has been. And I actually, and if you love this quote, my apologies, but I think it is, I think as it relates to entrepreneurship, I know we use this a lot in the startup space, but I think that this type of mentality is short-sighted, right? And it's short-sighted for all of the reasons we talk to entrepreneurs about. If we're all going to where the thing is going, if we're all headed in that direction, then perhaps what we should do is go where people aren't going, right? And we can see in the data where people aren't going. We are not funding women-owned businesses. We are not funding people of color-owned businesses. We know that there are these education gaps and these access gaps and these network gaps. And a lot of the solutions, and I've talked to a lot of you who are here today about some of these solutions. A lot of the solutions are not going to where the puck is going, but going in a completely different direction. And being creative about those things is where I think we need to go. So what I'm going to do is suggest some of the harder things and how I think we can move forward with some of these harder things. So potential solutions, right? And this is my last slide. How much time do I have, Julie? I started my timer, but I started it late. Do I have like 2 or 3 minutes?
Yeah.
So? Okay.
Yeah, you probably have a couple minutes. Anybody who needs to take a break can take a break, of course. This is the culmination, so.
Okay. All right, awesome. So I'll take like 2 or 3 minutes, and if there are questions or comments, I'm happy to engage about these things. So the first thing, and I know this is somewhat of an unpopular thing, but I'm going to say it anyway to a captive audience, but that is more broadly defining entrepreneurship, right? So I am a native of South Carolina. I moved back to South Carolina twice. So this is my second time coming back to South Carolina. I've lived all over the world. I've seen entrepreneurship in a lot of places, like many of you. And one of the places where I think we take a turn that is counterproductive is with narrowly defining entrepreneurship and using these terms that we can't even really define, right? Like high growth sectors, like high scaling, that are fluid terms. Or if we talk about what even the word scalable means and the industry. So I know there are industries that are hot. I know there are industries that we like to fund. I know that a lot of you here work in some of these places that are focused on these different fields like IT, like healthcare, like biotech, like advanced manufacturing and materials, and all of those things. But the local smaller businesses that are really overrepresented by women and people of color make up far more of the entrepreneurial sector, right? Than we want to give them credit for. And when we talk about the types of businesses that make up the entrepreneurial sector, we typically leave a lot of people out. And there are a lot of opportunities for us to support these businesses as entrepreneurs if we shift our way of thinking. And shifting our way of thinking with respect to entrepreneurship and changing what we think is actually scalable. Because I work with a lot of people who are disrupting different types of industries, and they're doing it in a way where they could never walk into like an SCRA and get funding because they're not in those 4 or 5 different sectors. They could never walk into like a Venture South probably and get funding. And I know you guys are here, and I like working with all of you, but there are a lot of people we are missing out on because we are not thinking about entrepreneurship in a way that is culturally inclusive. The second thing I would say about outreach and exposing Native diverse communities to traditional entrepreneurship. So even if we stick with this narrow focus of entrepreneurship as being high scaling, high growth sectors, blah, 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 whatever those things mean, exposing people to those traditional forms of entrepreneurship is important, but it's important to do so in a way that's crowdsourced, right? So like one of the challenges I've seen living in South Carolina, being an intellectual property lawyer in South Carolina for a number of years before coming back to work at Clemson, is the outreach often is, hey, I see a group of people who are marginalized and I want to help them. Not, there's a group of people who are marginalized who are not part of this ecosystem, and I want to work with them to provide solutions that are right for their communities. And I believe changing the conversation in this way, using community engagement to visit non-traditional spaces would be something that could be useful as we think about how to provide access. And just the other thing I would mention is accelerators are great. A lot of the things that we do in South Carolina are great, but oftentimes you're self-selecting, right? So by the time you get to an accelerator, you have been exposed to entrepreneurship in a number of different forms. And there's some things we do really well here, like Yes Carolina, like Apprenticeship Carolina, and there's some entrepreneurial strings in that program. But I certainly think that there are ways that we could broaden our outreach and our focus so that we bring more people into the fold. Also reimagining both deal flow and just the entire concept of providing capital, right? So like, yes, look for startups founded by women and people of color, provide opportunities for those, but also creating a broader array of capital for people who may not fit into a narrowly defined term that is entrepreneurship. And then finally, networks, providing access to legitimate mentoring networks. Mentoring is one of the metrics for the Relentless Challenge, right? And thinking about what your mentors look like and what they're willing to provide access to is important. Not just numbers, not just, hey, this is a person who said they could help, but who really is committed to providing access to legitimate mentoring networks. And I will stop there, Julie. If there are questions or people want to talk about any of these things, I'm happy to do that. But those are my high-level thoughts about inclusive entrepreneurship here.
Shontavia, oh, there you go. That was awesome. I think that when we asked you to come on and have a conversation, I think that that's exactly what we expected. You brought about, I'm not sure, you probably weren't able to see all the comments, really good comments. That's great. Wow. You know, who knew kind of thing. And as I mentioned, a lot of people are really hoping to